Hello, everyone. Welcome to Silicon Dragon Online. This is our third session that we've had since we started this series of episodes online a few weeks ago. And today we're going to be having Gary Rieschel from Qiming Venture joining us. And Gary is here, zooming in from Montana. And I'm here in Silicon Valley, zooming in. And I hope that all of you out there are zooming in from your various homes. I know we do have quite a few people on from New York, from Silicon Valley, from Asia. And so it's a good mix of people who are on. So just to introduce Gary a little bit, we have our webinar for the next hour, and we're going to be going through about 4 or 5 segments, talking a little bit about Gary's background and profile, and about Qiming and their investment style. And then we'll talk about how the COVID-19 is impacting VC fundraising. We'll talk about US-China relations. We'll talk about audience questions as well. So we'll be here for a full hour. You can use the chat function in order to ask questions, or you could use the Q&A function as well. So please warm up your questions because we'll get to those, and I'll try to get to those in stages so that we don't have all of them at the end. But thank you very much for joining us. So a little bit about Gary. Gary has 20 years experience as a venture capitalist. And he's lived in Japan, he's lived in Shanghai, he's lived in the US. He has co-founded or sponsored 4 actually, funds in China, VC firms in China. Qiming is now on its 14th fund and has $5.3 billion under management. 5 of those funds are R&B funds. Gary is now running the healthcare investing for the firm out of the US, but still very, very active on the investment committee for Qiming in China. And he has, to his credit, 13 companies that he's led investments in US and China that have managed to achieve $1 billion or more in market cap. So it's quite a record of, over the years of being in the forefront of US and China and a little bit of Japan as well in here over the last 20 years. And Gary, welcome. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Good. So why don't we launch into a little bit about your history. So you're plugged in now from Montana, but you might not have been there 2 months ago. You would have been in Seattle, right?
Yeah, I was home in Seattle now. So we left China in 2016 and moved to Seattle. So Seattle is now the official home.
Okay. How does your life in Seattle contrast with life in Shanghai?
Oh, it's much quieter.
Yeah.
The thing you realize about China during the period that I was there, 2005, 2016, an incredible pace, a great deal of changing. Not only the company, as we grew the company, the city, the market, venture capital community, all those things were moving at breakneck speed. And even though Seattle is a fairly energetic city, Silicon Valley is a fairly energetic place, it really doesn't quite, keep up with the pace and, nature of China.
Yeah, but that I agree with that, and I think having spent a lot of time in China as well, but not 12 years like you, but definitely the pace is a lot faster there. The competition is more heightened than it is in the US. So a lot of the ferocious competitors out there in China. So what about how Qiming actually, how you stay involved with Qiming in China? How do you communicate with the team in China? How's that working?
Well, so for now, last night we had a 3-hour call that was going through all the budgets, all the compensation, everything for the management of the firm. There are weekly calls on deals. So the traditional VC Monday meeting continues, and I get those materials 2 to 3 days in advance, and either call into the meeting or vote and make those decisions. Continue to make those decisions that way. So there's at least weekly interaction with the team, but it's usually quite a bit more frequent than that.
Right, and is that done over Zoom or another platform?
We have a WebEx connection for
Okay.
Qiming, a corporate connection that we use for the video conferencing and investment committee meetings.
Okay.
Last night was Zoom, but
Okay. And these are set up as meetings, right?
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, it's really interesting about these 4 China VC firms that you've been involved with, and can you share some lessons learned from all your experience in helping to shape these funds, and lessons learned from investing in China over the years too? What's the number one? Is there a number one lesson or a couple lessons?
Well, there's some lessons relative to having run venture funds before. So when I started as a VC, it was in 1995, and Masayoshi Son asked me to start the SoftBank Venture Capital Group. So I did that based in Silicon Valley, and we built that team. And then in '99, Chauncey Shea was starting SoftBank China, so we went over and spent some time working with him to help that entity get off the ground. And then in 2000, Cisco bought SoftBank out of a joint venture that I'd created when I was at Cisco. That led to a fund called SAFE, SoftBank Asia Infrastructure Fund. So I launched that, and after the first year, hired Andy Yan to run that fund. And then the other fund that I launched before Qiming was a fund with Feng Bo, who was initially involved with Cheng Wei, with Eric Lee, and then he started Seiyuan. And so Jack Wadsworth, Sandy Robertson, a couple of us were the original investors behind that. So Qiming came about because my family decided to move to China so our kids could have an experience there. So we came in January of 2005. And it was right at the beginning of the institutionalization of the venture capital industry in China. And so you could tell that it was going to wind up being a fairly significant event. Just having been exposed for several years between SoftBank China, SAFE, et cetera, being exposed to what was going on in China, you could tell that as more and more money started to come into the market and it became more of a formalized structure, it was going to be a fairly enjoyable or interesting place to be. So that was really the genesis behind 2005 deciding to start Qiming with Dwayne Kwong. But Dwayne left Intel Capital to join me in starting up Qiming.
Yeah, I remember covering quite a few of these incidents, and as a journalist, tracking venture capital from Silicon Valley into China and other parts of Asia. So I remember many of these steps along the way. And now today, with your healthcare investing out of the U.S., that is also rather, forward thinking, I think. And so tell us about that. How did you come into this idea, and how's it going?
So when you had mentioned earlier about the lessons learned, the part I left out in the first piece was when we launched SoftBank in Silicon Valley in '99 and 2000, I didn't have the experience then to actually know that you can't let the partners, no matter how good your partners are, you can't let them just do what they want. And so if you look back at who the SoftBank partners were, Heidi Roizen, who was very famous before SoftBank, has done really well after. Brad Feld, very famous before, not as famous before, but very famous after with Foundry. Fred Wilson was at Flatiron, and then Union Square. We had a phenomenal group of people that we were working with, but I didn't have the experience to say, you can't just let everyone do the deals they like. And we were too collegial. So I made the mistake of letting the group, we were too friendly with each other, and you lost the edge on the deals. So the biggest learning that we applied against Qiming, inside Qiming, was we're friendly, we like each other, we socialize, et cetera, but you keep a very sharp edge when it comes to discussions around the deals. So in terms of the learning from SoftBank to Qiming, that would be the single biggest learning that I had. If you think about if you think about what happened at the formation of Qiming, we made two decisions that have continued to shape the culture of the firm. One is, if you're a managing partner, your compensation became the same as me the next day. So there was no such thing as a junior managing partner. So as people were promoted to that rank, they immediately had the same cash and the same carry compensation as me. That was very unusual for China in the time and remains relatively unusual for China. The other thing we did was organize around sectors. So we started a healthcare sector in 2006. No one was doing healthcare in China, or virtually no one was doing healthcare there. And Nisa and William Hu, Nisa Lin and William Hu have launched that, and that has now become, the largest and most successful by any measure healthcare practice in China. So we were early in picking healthcare to invest in the Chinese market, and that's paid off really well for us. Then when I returned to the US in 2016, we set up a fund in the US that's now raised roughly $300 million in two funds, and that fund is focused on doing healthcare in the US. So we're taking the learnings and the exposure and understanding we've had from the Chinese market and also applying that in the US market.
Right. So Qiming is one of the longer lasting, prominent VC firms doing US and China today. What do you think about some of the newer China VC players that have come along? We actually have a question related to that. I think the question is also hinting at the point about whether deals are going to be a lot harder to get through and whether term sheets are going to be, not followed through with now during these kind of harsher times. So maybe we could shift a little bit into how this current climate is impacting venture capital investing, venture capital fundraising, and what you think the outlook is.
Well, let's be really blunt about the Chinese venture capital industry. It's never had a downturn, ever. So the people back in 2000, 2001, there were virtually no VCs working in China, institutional VCs. So starting between 2005 and today, there have not been a lot of down cycles. So the thing that, VCs have not had to go through the triage of managing their portfolios the way that venture capital in the US had over the last 40, 50 years. So this is the first time that triage is going to become a very common term, whatever the Chinese translation is of that particular word. The other thing that's very different now is that the entrepreneurs haven't gone through this either. So the idea of down rounds, the idea of all the new round ratchets and things, those are also things that have not necessarily been part of the VC landscape in China, and that's going to start to become a much more prevalent part of the landscape. There's enough money in venture capital in China to support the good companies. There isn't enough money to support everybody. And so the entrepreneurs are now for the first time going to be sitting across the table from VCs who have to really think about whether they can raise additional money for their funds in the future. So fundraising throughout the entire chain will become more difficult. LPs are going to become more selective about which GPs they back, and the GPs, both for new deals and for existing deals, will have to become much more selective. And this is the first time that this system has been stressed this way.
Right. And do you think this is a long-term impact, short-term impact?
Everything associated with the COVID virus is long-term. There is absolutely nothing about this virus and the impact it's having that's going to be short-term. Because you can look at the trends of working from home, you can look at the trends of telehealth, you can look at the trends of online education. Every single one of these are going to be decade-long transitions. And what the virus did is the virus stole a decade. So it put history on fast forward. So what it did was it said, you thought you had 10, 15 years thinking ahead to these kind of transitions, and now you don't. That time is gone. And so everyone's going to have to think pretty hard about what the implications are for their own business in that.
Right. So it seems that your timing in raising this latest capital was really excellent. You just got it closed in the nick of time.
Well, I have a reputation.
But that must have been a rather varied experience. Tell us about that.
So last year we made some management changes in Qiming. So in 2019 we restructured the firm, and that we knew that would raise some questions with LPs because every time you do that, that's going to cause some questions. So we were prepared for that. I'm involved in quite a few U.S.-China discussion topics and organizations, and we were prepared for that. What you really were not necessarily prepared for was certainly the COVID virus and what that did for logistics in terms of trying to do diligence, trying to get entrepreneurs, instead of going to meetings in Shanghai, get them into the US so they can meet with LPs. The entire Qiming team, we had to reorganize everyone's schedule the third week in January, around the 23rd, 24th of January. We basically decided to flip all of our diligence meetings from being in China to being in the Bay Area. So we had to get everyone to the Bay Area early enough to complete 2 weeks of quarantine before they could meet with LPs. So there's a huge amount of logistics around COVID and what the implications were for that. The other part that we were not necessarily as aware of, aware of it, but not to the point of the real impact, was how a lot of limited partners now are way over their model allocations for venture. And part of that's tied to all the huge valuations. The good news is part of that's tied to all the huge valuations in the numerator of their model. So they have a lot of big markups that haven't gone public, so they haven't received liquidity on that. But then also in the first quarter of this year, we saw huge hits to their other asset bases. So the denominator effect with the stock market and things. So we picked a time to raise a fund in a relatively perfect storm of challenges, and it's a real tribute to the team. So the Qiming team is good. The results have been good, and also our LP base is really solid. So we did a $1 billion fund on the original schedule and the original target, and I would say that is not something a lot of firms will be able to do this year.
Did the team go back to China now?
Everyone else, yeah, everyone's back, and everyone's satisfied their quarantine. So we've had 2 IPOs this year. We've closed 5 new investments. We've had, I think, 7 or 8 follow-on financings now completed. So I would say for the within China piece of activity, it's not back 100% to normal, but it's in the 75-80% range.
Okay, so we have a question here from Anthony, and I'm going to allow him to talk, and you can unmute, Anthony.
Hey, Gary. One question I had was, how does the way that investors do diligence on potential investments differ in the US and China? And how does the role that VCs play with portfolio companies differ between the 2 countries? Like, for example, how you would be a board member to your companies?
Right. So the diligence process, the biggest, let's go back to 2005. The process then to due diligence was very difficult because the accounting infrastructure to support venture wasn't there, the legal infrastructure, you didn't have a lot of historical context when you were looking at deals. And so what you relied upon was the network that you had in China and the relationships you had with the other people in the market. And you needed to find people that would tell you the truth about something. And so it was very much an interpersonal form of diligence. You'll go forward 15 years to today, I would say it's the 2 markets are now not dissimilar in terms of the kind of diligence you do. So the market analysis, there's plenty of data about China, the trends in China, the robust nature of the entrepreneurial networks, the VC networks, all of those things have matured, the accounting infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, such that those 2 markets now I view as fully institutionalized. So the diligence process today, maybe you approach it in China with a little more skepticism than you might in the US, but I actually view them now as starting to become quite similar. And then what was the other part of the question?
Yeah, so the other part of the question was, how does the role you play with portfolio companies differ? Like, for example, your role as a board member.
So the biggest difference between the Chinese portfolio and the US portfolio is in China, it's virtually impossible to replace the CEOs. So it is very common when you're doing a deal in the US to talk to the CEO and say, you know, your skill set is going to take us to X, and then we're going to need to bring people in to take us to Y. That is a common conversation. And I would say during the SoftBank days, we probably replaced half the CEOs during the course of the life of the investment. That is extremely difficult to do in China. So you have to be far more careful in terms of the personality, the integrity, the kind of the ability, the organizational development ability of the CEOs you invest in China. You have to be much more careful with that because it's much harder to replace them. That's the singularly biggest difference.
Thank you.
Mike.
Rebecca, you're on mute.
Okay. Okay.
I can't hear you, Rebecca.
Oh, okay. There we are. Okay. Unmute audio. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Alice, can you hear us? Can you go ahead and ask your question? She needs to unmute her mic.
There she is.
Okay. Hello, Alice. How are
Hello?
you?
Yeah,
You want to ask your question now?
yeah. You just do a lot of green tech energy, and then you talk about the green tech initiative. What is the biggest green tech initiative right now, the trend in China?
So we had a practice, we had a green and clean tech practice in China for a number of years, and we basically moved away from that because what we found was that the government involvement in a large number of those deals was really important, and that wound up being the deciding factor as opposed to the quality of the people or the quality of the technology. I think the things that are receiving a great deal of attention now in that area in China, I think water, both wastewater treatment at the municipal level, rural level, water management is an area of receiving a great deal of attention. Food quality, food certification, organic food, organic farming, those are areas that are derivatives of that are receiving a great deal of attention. We have a company, Lanzatech, that takes emissions from steel mills and converts those to either ethanol or high value chemicals. And so they now have partnerships with two of the largest steel companies in the world in China, as well as 5 companies outside. So those are examples. Clearly there's a huge solar industry and wind industry in China, both from a manufacturing and implementation perspective. And then I think one of the biggest changes China's made over the last 5 to 8 years is becoming more open with both state grid and southern grid, such that they could take alternative energy like wind and solar and take those into the grid. So again, it started with a great deal of capital being wasted in non-profitable solar operations, either the manufacturing side or the farms themselves, the installations themselves. Same thing on wind. And again, like most things in China, it got ahead of itself, but now it's getting caught up and it's becoming more reasonable. Electric vehicles have a massive amount of attention for an investment perspective, probably too many. I think there's 115, 120 companies trying to make electric vehicles of some kind. Clearly, not that many are going to survive. So almost everything in China gets overfunded on the front end, and then you go through a very painful process to select the winners over 5, 10, 20 years. And electric vehicles are in that process today.
Yeah, I remember writing a whole chapter on them in my new book, Tech Titans of China, and a chapter on venture capital as well, where Gary was very much a part of that because he's helped to define the whole history of China venture. But we have a question here from Matt Sheehan, and Matt is the author of the Trans-Pacific Experiment, and he wants to know, I'll just read his question, he's sent it in by chat. How would you describe the trajectory and impact of government guidance funds on the Chinese tech sector? And has this model been applied at all to Chinese tech companies' overseas ventures?
So we do not see the guidance funds from the government having a great impact on the market. They make a lot of noise. They announce very large amounts of money, but you almost never see the total amount of money announced make its way into the companies or into the marketplace. What it has done, though, it has created a perception that what's happening in venture, what's happening with the startup community in China is directed by the government. And I think that's a terrible misunderstanding. The entrepreneurs in China don't wait to be told what the government wants them to do. They may look at the 5-year plans, they may look at Made in China 2025, so that they're not going to go directly against those plans, but they're also not waiting around for the government to say, well, you should do this in AI. And it's quite a misconception in the US at the policy level and many other levels that that China's pulling the strings with all of the entrepreneurs in the tech sector. The guidance funds now, some of them, they also differ quite widely. So 35 to $40 billion going into semiconductors, that is focused enough and at scale and has professional management that is strong enough that it may have a real impact. But a lot of the local regional funds are tied to local governments, and the trick is to get the money, you have to locate in that particular government, so you have a geographic specificity, which is exactly counter to the way venture works, which we trade in ideas. So we're always looking for what's the best idea. We don't think what's the best idea in Beijing, what's the best idea in Chongqing. And so the guidance funds, because they're implemented through a lot of local government officials, they want to have something in their own particular geography, and which dramatically reduces both the impact and I think the efficiency of that structure. In terms of the model applied at all to Chinese tech companies overseas, I don't see that at all. I don't see any relationship between the overseas behavior of whether it's the BATs or Chinese VC. I don't see any relationship between the guidance funds and those entities at all.
Do you think that China's tech innovation is entering into a period where it's going to be more innovative or less innovative?
Well, I think it's going to be more innovative. Again, you can just look at the statistics. So when we launched Qiming in 2005, or end of 2005, that year there was one novel pharmaceutical compound approved for release in China. Last year there were several hundred, half of which were brought in from overseas, which shows more opening in the market from that side, and half were domestically developed. And so there's a long explanation of how that happened in pharma, but that's an extraordinary development to create that kind of ecosystem in a 15-year period. What happens in China is the waves, we're going through a big wave now where the consumer internet side, the shared economy, gig economy and things, is going to go through a very difficult time. And I think that funding those companies in the model where they were used to being funded, where you paid escalating prices for customers, and you would make it up in volume. I think that whole fantasy world is disappearing relatively quickly. So you're seeing more and more focus on really solving particular solutions. You're solving a particular problem. That's really the AI focus for China. And I think the focus on solving the kind of problems that China has with AI and the amount of data that the consumer side has generated, there's vast opportunities for creativity and innovation there.
Right, and you have a portfolio company, Face++, and it's been in kind of the hot seat over the U.S.-China relations, and the IPO. Tell us about your view of the company, and also in the backdrop, against the backdrop of U.S.-China relations and what's going on with the IPO.
Yeah, Face++ or Megvii has been. So what was interesting with that company is when we invested, they had virtually no government business at all. And then the government approached them. We started to sell down our position back in 2015. What happened was, I forget which organization was, but a global organization, maybe from the UN, labeled them a company that was part of the surveillance infrastructure for China. And they specifically focused on Xinjiang with what was happening with the Uyghurs. Turns out that it was less than 1% of Megvii's business was tied to Xinjiang. And in fact, they did not even know what the government was using their products for. So later, that institution said Megvii should be taken off the list. but by then the damage is done. So you're already in the press, you're already on the blacklist with Huawei, Sensitime, et cetera. And so they've worked really hard to try to show people that they're not an entity of the Chinese government, but it's an ongoing process for them in their IPO.
Right. So what areas besides AI? Okay, but you think that that is going to happen this year or not? The IPO will happen this year or not?
My ability to predict IPOs is extremely limited. We have 20 companies that are in the process of listing in China, either in China or Hong Kong. So of the 20, there are 4 or 5 that have actually gone through the filing process, and then there are many others that are preparing. And so we don't talk about those companies because I don't want to jinx them. But fundamentally, we have an incredible IPO pipeline within the Qiming portfolio. About 12 of the 20 are healthcare. 8 of the 20 are what I'd call more core technology. So I think that thus far the Chinese IPO market and capital markets have continued to function pretty well, even with all of the drama around the COVID virus.
Right. Well, you have another Chinese tech company that's been very much in the headlines, ByteDance. And TikTok has been getting hit quite a bit lately in the US press as being not trusted. Congress is pointing fingers, saying we shouldn't be using it.
Yeah, I can get in a lot of trouble offering my opinions on the U.S. Congress and government. Nancy Pelosi stood up last week and said Zoom. She doesn't use Zoom because it's a Chinese company, and it's stupid. I mean, it's just plain dumb. They have a Chinese founder. My God, does that mean every company that has a Chinese employee is suddenly a Chinese company? We're in la la land on all of this. It's crazy. And so for me, ByteDance has a particular, with the success of TikTok, people start to be worried about the influence, and they did catch themselves starting to maybe act as if they were in China in the US. So that the companies that are going to want to play in media in the US, you're going to have pretty clear rules that you can't apply Chinese rules to the US, just like China won't allow US companies to apply US rules in China. You're going to have to have reciprocity in that regard. And so for companies to get that big that quickly, there'll be a learning process for it. Just like Zoom had to learn how to handle some of the volume, and it was routing data and traffic to servers in China to help handle the volume. I don't think there's anything malicious in that. They were just trying to load balance their network. But companies are going to have to learn going through that entire sensitivity. And it's a really complex issue.
And you think TikTok is totally separately managed from the China side?
So, do I think so? Sure.
Yeah.
But what I think about this subject is not really what matters. It's what the legislators wind up thinking, and it's how the company winds up behaving. But I personally have never seen anything within ByteDance or TikTok that makes me feel it is a surrogate for the Chinese media infrastructure.
Right. Let's get a little deeper and a little bit more broadly into the China-U.S. relations now. We were both on a webinar about 10 days ago from Washington, D.C. that talked about competition or collaboration, and so we delved into that. And curious to know what your view is. Are we at a low point now in China relations? Do you think things are going to get better? Is there any hope for things to get better? What are we going to become tech superpowers fighting it out? Just what is your overall view?
So if I say I'm a venture capitalist, I'm an optimist by definition, right? So because I'm investing in companies that have no business, sometimes no staff, they don't have a product yet, and I'm assuming that we can help them be successful over time. So I think what you see now is anything that can be politicized between the US and China is going to be politicized. So the policy folks, Xi has his own particular reasons to do things first to strengthen his position in the Chinese people. Trump, it's an election year, Trump, Biden, that whole universe, I mean, that quote again from Nancy Pelosi about Zoom being a Chinese company. I mean, this is the third most powerful person in the United States. You have got to be kidding me that's stupid. I mean, so the fact that you see that even coming from Nancy Pelosi, who's in San Francisco, for God's sake, tells me that everything between the US and China at that level is now political. What I look at are entrepreneurs. Again, remember, we trade in ideas. So what we look for are entrepreneurs who want to solve problems. I have great confidence that the entrepreneurs in China and the entrepreneurs in the US will find ways to collaborate when they need to solve problems both in China and the US. And the reality is most of the really difficult problems in the world will require entrepreneurs from both countries to work together. Same thing with researchers. So I think that the scientists and the people focused on solving problems will find ways to cooperate. But right now, in the political infrastructure between the US and China, we are definitely at a low point on the political conversation.
And what about cross-border tech investing, US, China?
Well, cross-border tech investing, so again, I don't think the capital flows were large. You have to really dig into understanding why that was. There was an awful lot of money in China that wanted to be outside of China. And so almost every wealthy family wound up with someone representing money to try to invest in startups in Silicon Valley, et cetera. That's all gone. That's pretty well disappeared. It's gotten much more restrictive in getting the money out of China. The CFIUS rules, and again, the politicization of CFIUS was not really intended for how it's being applied today. That's definitely put a damper where entrepreneurs would say, well, why do I want to put myself in the position of taking money that's going to cause that kind of review? Even SoftBank, which has nothing to do with China in terms of its sources of capital or its management, even SoftBank was put under a lot of issues with CFIUS reviews. So when you take a tool like that and you turn it into a blunt instrument like a hammer, it's going to have a chilling effect on the market. So cross-border China money into the US right now is pretty much dead. We don't see a great deal of that. Even the large BAT companies that are playing with dollar-based currency, even they have backed off dramatically. But again, these things will come in waves, and these things will come in cycles. There's still a great deal of US capital, vis-a-vis things like Qiming's latest fund. There's a great deal of US capital still being deployed in China in the venture capital community. But the Chinese money, really, it's not available to do venture capital in the US the way that our dollars are available to do venture capital in China. Not at this time.
And along those lines, do you see a decoupling of the two nations, of these two tech innovation spheres developing because of this split, this political split, this cross-border tech investing that's dried up? Are we going to see China developing its own technologies, the US developing its own technologies, and we're not going to have compatible standards, or what do you see?
So the key word is one of the last words you used. So the standards are really the key. Not that many products wind up being relevant for a standards battle. 5G happens to be one where there's real serious standard discussions and standard body issues that you want to be able to address. And I think that the standard bodies will wind up having certain implementations of 5G in China that'll be different than the US, but I don't think you're going to have a fundamentally different standard. I think it's more important when you look at things like AI. Right now, the US and China are not able to have a really good discussion around what are the rules of the road for AI? What are the privacy rules for AI? How can this be applied? We're seeing this affect how drugs and things are being developed. Patient data. China's actually more open on patient data and the sharing of that. The US is going to have to decide if it wants to move in that direction. So, but those are not, that isn't really a battle between the two. And I also fundamentally think the market is really the world market. If you're a technology company, we've been used to, for a very long time, distribution almost being free. The best PC in 1988, 1989 was the NEC Q-Hachi, the NEC 98. By far and away, it was the best PC on the planet. But the Japanese made the mistake of optimizing it so much for the Japanese market that it could never be cost effective or prevalent in the world market. And they got crushed in the 1991 to 93 timeframe. China, trying to go down its own path to develop its own technology, needs to be very careful that it doesn't repeat that particular problem and make things so specific for the Chinese market that it cannot be used and cannot be implemented in the rest of the world. If they do that, we'll lose, and they'll lose badly. I think they're very smart about this, but I think that's always the danger when you try to put a moat around technology. It's like trying to put a moat around water. It's not, technology wants to move, it wants to flow. And so I think it's a terrible mistake to somehow think you're going to create an island of technology.
What about some of these drug development vaccine testing companies that you have in your Chinese portfolio, and testing kits and vaccines? And you've even had some pushback from the US side over whether those could be used in the US.
Well, so on the vaccine, we haven't had pushback yet, but the Chinese company CanSino will probably be the first Chinese company to have a vaccine in the market. And the testing is going really well at this point. So
in Wuhan, right? In Wuhan.
Yeah, so that company is likely to be one of the first in the world. They and J&J, but I think CanSino will be a little bit ahead. It'll be a very interesting case if next winter we start to have a recurrence, or in the fall we have a recurrence, and the CanSino vaccine is tested and released by the China FDA and is in the market. And it'll be very interesting to see if the US FDA says, we've tested it, it's ready to go, let's order 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, let's order it from China because it's ready and American patients need that. It'll be a very interesting test case of this entire question if the US says, well, we don't trust that, we don't want to bring it in. And we've had one company, Infravision, that has a very advanced image processing, AI-driven image processing capability, so they can look at a lung and they can tell you almost, in a matter of minutes, whether or not you've had any exposure to COVID. It was derived from something they were doing for lung cancer. A very senior government official in the US said, we don't want Chinese AI. Even though that system it's being used in Italy, it's being approved for Japan, that system could arguably save lives, it could affect you. So that type of thing makes me sick when I see that. But we will, again, we'll see when we have a real vaccine in the marketplace, we'll see what the political impact or discussion is.
Right. Well, seeing the comparisons between the US and China in how they've handled the COVID-19, and China seems to have handled it better than the US, at least if you believe the reports. And we have, this whole situation has spotlighted so many weaknesses in our whole US economy, in supply chains and testing and getting things on stream to fight this. I mean, do you think that the US is in for a major reset, or are we just going to sink in?
Well, I think the US and I think
going forward.
Well, I think actually this will wind up spurring innovation across a very wide range. First of all, when you say handle better, I think China certainly handled the response, but I think the acknowledgement from China early as to the problem was really inappropriate and cost everyone in the world a lot of time.
Sure.
The US administration made a mistake on a CDC-derived test that was not really effective, and that cost 4 to 6 weeks in terms of ramping up the testing in the United States. Mm-hmm. But setting all of that aside, this virus has actually done something quite interesting, and it's two sides of a coin. The virus side of the coin is it's pointed out the weakness in everything it's touched. So it's pointed out a weakness in how how you look at this and the spread of the virus, the actual manifestation of the disease. It's looked at the care. It's looked at the sourcing of materials. It's looked at the sourcing of the reagents for the testing. Everything it's touched,
Yeah.
it's affected.
Right.
The other side of the coin is the technology that's going to solve the problem. That will also wind up having an impact on everything it touches. And it won't always be graceful. So when you start looking at online education, the commercial real estate market, I don't know about China, but I would submit the commercial real estate market in both China and the US is going to take a really severe hit. Online education is not going to go back to the way it is. Not education won't go back to the way it was. Working from home, many companies are finding they're more productive. They're not going to need as many people or as much office. So you go down the list, and this virus and the cures for it have wound up pointing a weakness in virtually all of our systems,
Yeah.
whether it's China or the US.
Yeah, remember when we couldn't get face masks? You know, I got these face masks in a package from China, from Shenzhen, from one of the Chinese tech titan companies. There's 50 of them in here. I didn't have a mask until then. And a lot of other people in the US didn't have them either. I mean, we were just so weak.
You have some Q&A, right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, I want to get to Jason here. Jason, I'm gonna allow you to talk now. Hi, Jason. Are you? I'm going to unmute you now so you can talk. Jason. Okay.
He's still.
Hello, Jason. Well. I'm trying to get.
What was his question about? The new VCs?
Oh, there he is. Jason, go ahead. Jason, can you unmute your mic? Does he know how to do that?
Okay, yes, I'm, it's
Good.
automatically
Hi, Jason.
muted, yes. You know,
Okay.
my question is that since you are dealing with really the frontier and the core of the capital world, how do you think there's a lot of hypes about this Chinese overtaking America in this technology area? Do you think what's Chinese technology readiness level to compete with US for the future? You know, the future sources of new company and new investment.
So the way I think about that is it all comes down to the entrepreneurs. And I would say that part of the reaction you see from the US today is the US has not had a competitor on the entrepreneurial side at scale ever.
No.
It's had technology developed in Japan, but Japan was not a terribly entrepreneurial society. It's still not a terribly entrepreneurial society. There were European entrepreneurs, but never at scale. So I think what you have to look at is, for the first time, the US looks around and says, wow, there's a country that has a venture capital market and an entrepreneurial community that's roughly the same size as us. And arguably, in certain things, payments, e-commerce, a whole series of the online to offline marketplaces was actually started to move ahead of the US. So I think competition is a good thing. So I'm not terribly bothered by China starting to be looked as a real alternative to technology for the United States. I think it's healthy for the United States. You have to have confidence in your own systems, and I think the U.S. has proven that it has a very flexible, very resilient entrepreneurial community. So I don't think it's a question of China moving ahead of the U.S. or the U.S. moving ahead of China. I think it's a question of how do we set the guidelines to have a really fair competition, and the best products and services from the best entrepreneurs should win. Right now, governments on both sides are maybe a little more involved than I'd like to see.
Okay.
Thank
All right,
you
we have
very much.
another question here from Abe. Abe, Abe, go ahead. You can unmute your mic.
Actually, hi, Gary. My question was already answered about the AI situation.
Okay.
It was discussed to a great extent. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay, that's good. Glad to hear that. Any other questions out there from our large group? Okay. What do you think make Qiming Venture more successful versus other competitors? Is it identifying the right investments or the execution, operational excellence on investments?
So, yeah, it's a good question, because in China, again, going back to the fact you need to be really selective as to how you choose the CEOs that you're investing in. I would say that Qiming has a very supportive culture around supporting entrepreneurs. The backgrounds of most of the Qiming partners, they have a great deal of operating experience. NISA had set up healthcare distribution companies, hospitals. Dwayne had run a large part of Cisco sales channels and was an engineer at Calpana before it was acquired by Cisco. So you kind of go through the backgrounds. So we actually try to select people who can sit across from a CEO or an entrepreneur and say, we know how to help you. We understand the situation you're in. So there's a maturity associated with that. I also think we have a culture that's very open, going back to the conversation around how we handle compensation in the firm. If you're at a level within the firm, your compensation is very close to everyone else, and we're pretty open and on and flexible in terms of how we converse about that. So I think we're one of the most successful firms. I'd say we're the best healthcare investor in China. I can't say we're the best TMT investor in China. I think Sequoia, SIG, there's a Matrix. There's a handful of firms that have done extraordinarily well. I think we belong in the discussion as being a good to great TMT investor, but I'm not going to say we're the best. Healthcare, I can honestly say I think we're the best. So what that does, it means if you look at the list of the 10 best firms in China, we're in that list. And every firm has its own special sauce, if you will, its own personality that differentiates it. A lot of Qiming, a lot of it really is the culture and the team orientation that we've put together.
Okay, good answer. So we have a question from Russ Hall, a chat. He says, the SEC had a harsh view today on Chinese companies, ostensibly rooted in the financial fraud of Luckin Coffee, among others. Do you see this as just politics at the moment or a longer issue with reporting results?
Unfortunately, this is not going to be a politics of the moment. It was very unfortunate that Luckin happened to have that debacle occur when it did, because there are so many people, again, in the political infrastructure just itching for a fight and just itching to have the SEC say, see, you cannot trust the financial data of the Chinese firms that are listed on these American exchanges. Why are we making any exceptions for the Chinese firms in terms of the financial data they have to supply? So it's a disaster, I think, for that overall market. And so it's going to get a great deal of political play. And I think it's going to wind up, I don't know where this is going to go, but I would say there's a significant chance that that the SEC will wind up being very, very strict in terms of what Chinese companies have to disclose in terms of financial data in the future. And then those firms will have to decide, do they want to continue to list in the US market or not? This probably could not have come at a worse time.
Okay. Let's get to Bill Lee and allow Bill to talk. Bill, allow you to talk. Bill, you want to unmute your mic?
Oh,
Okay, there he is.
sorry, sorry, I didn't really have a question. I think I pressed the wrong button.
Oh,
But,
really? You're sure you're in the
talk
spotlight now? You're really in the spotlight now. You better come up with something. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
okay.
Don't worry about it. So, all right. Well, look, if there are no more burning questions, I would really like to thank Gary for his time today. And I really think he shed a lot of light on many of the issues that we're all facing today. And I think we will have a recording of this available for everyone as well. There were a few additional questions. If we have, well, maybe one more minute, We talked about the IPO pipeline. We talked about the state of VC industry in China pre and post-COVID. We talked about biotech innovation. Usually takes longer time frame to get returns. How do you think of biotech investing viewed in China, given capital in China seem to look for much quicker return horizon?
Yeah, so one thing about that one thing about the RMB funds that's changed is that RMB funds up until the last 3 or 4 years really had a very low risk profile and was not interested in doing things that, you know, you're going to develop a new drug. It's going to take 3, 5, 7, 8, 10 years before you have that in the market. There was very little interest there. That's changing. So there are now pools of RMB available for that kind of investing, whereas certainly when we started Qiming, there was no risk capital in RMB coming from the RMB pools at all. But that's been a significant change in the last several years.
Okay. Well, good. I think we are going to be wrapping up our session here today. And so I'm just going to share the screen with you so you know what's coming up next with our Silicon Dragon online series, which we started on a weekly basis. And you can see here, Gary. And our next one next week, actually April 29, is with Jay of Samsung Ventures, TransLink, and now DTCP, which he's just joined. So Jay will be joining us next week at 4 p.m. on Wednesday. We're doing it on Wednesday instead of Thursday, our usual time, because May 1st is a holiday in China, so we want to avoid that. And we are trying to do these around 4 p.m. Pacific time so that we capture some Asia audience as well. And the next one after that is May 7th with Jeff Chi of Vickers Venture. Vickers is also just raised some new capital. Jeff is based in Shanghai. He also spends time in Singapore. So we welcome these next two, and we have a few more lined up after that every week. But if you liked what you saw today, I hope that you'll tune in for next week and the week after and the weeks after that. I hope that you'll check out our various properties that we have through Silicon Dragon Ventures, our videos, our podcasts, these webinars, our newsletter, books, and also our membership community, which gives you a lot of benefits like some passes to these webinars and also to our VIP dinners. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars, and thank you again, everyone, for participating. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.